The engine had been ticking for 6 minutes before she turned it off. Dorothy Holden sat in the parking lot of Family Foods on Route 41 in Clarksville, Tennessee, with her hands still on the wheel and her eyes on the store's front window. The sun was low and orange, and it caught the dust on her windshield in a way that made the whole world look like it was slowly burning. It was the second Wednesday of November. It was 4:47 in the afternoon. It was 52 degrees outside, and the heater in her car had stopped working sometime in September, and she hadn't done anything about it because doing something about it cost money, and money was the one thing she had the least of. She had counted the coins before she left the house. She had counted them on the kitchen table with Owen watching from the doorway and Grace on the linoleum floor behind him with a crayon she'd found under the refrigerator, drawing something orange and private on a piece of paper bag. Dorothy had counted quietly so Owen wouldn't ask questions. He was 8 years old and he was already too good at math. He would have looked at the pile on the table and known what it meant. And she didn't want him to know what it meant. Not yet, not today. $5.83. That was what she had until Friday. And Friday was 2 days away, and 2 days was a long time, when the refrigerator was nearly empty, and two children ate 3 times a day, and neither of them had had anything since the half sandwich she'd made Owen for lunch at noon. She'd told them she was running in to get something for dinner. She'd said it the way you say things to children when the truth is too heavy to lift in their direction. She'd said it lightly off the shoulder, like it was nothing, like she knew exactly what she was getting and it was going to be fine. Owen had nodded. Grace had not looked up from her orange drawing. Dorothy had put on her coat and walked out to the car and sat in it for 6 minutes before she found the courage to turn off the engine. The thing was, she knew what she was here for. She was here for the discount rack. The dented cans and the day-old bread and the bruised apples they moved to a basket near the back when they started going soft. She'd been here before. Not this store. She'd never shopped at Family Foods before, but she'd been in this situation before. In the weeks after her son Danny's funeral, when the casseroles from the neighbors stopped coming and the condolence cards stopped arriving, and the world went quiet and resumed its regular programming and left her standing in it with 2 small children and a mailbox full of bills. Danny had been 38 years old. He'd been driving home from a job site on a Tuesday evening in March. The kind of unremarkable Tuesday that has no business being anyone's last day, and a pickup truck had run a red light on Riverside Drive and hit his car on the driver's side at 40 miles an hour. He died at Vanderbilt University Medical Center 7 hours later. Dorothy had been in the waiting room with Grace asleep across her lap when the doctor came out. She remembered the doctor's shoes. She didn't know why she remembered the shoes, brown loafers, worn down on one heel. She could still see them when she closed her eyes at night. Melissa, Danny's wife, the children's mother, had lasted 5 weeks. Dorothy understood it, or tried to. Grief ate people differently. Some people it filled up, and some people it hollowed out, and Melissa was the hollowed out kind. She packed a bag one morning when the children were at school, called a rideshare to her sister's place in Phoenix, and sent Dorothy a text message that said, "Only I can't. I'm sorry, please take care of them." There had been no further contact, no phone calls. No letters, no birthday cards for Owen or Grace. Whatever shape Melissa had been before Danny died, the grief had broken it past fitting back together. Dorothy had not judged her. She had almost not survived her own grief. The difference was she had 2 reasons in the next room that required feeding. She got out of the car. She stood for a moment in the parking lot with her coat pulled tight and her purse held against her side, and she looked at the store's automatic doors and she breathed. Then she walked. The automatic doors opened with a sound like a small exhale, and the warm air of the store moved over her face, and for a half second, the warmth was so simple and so good that she stood in the doorway and just breathed it in. The cashier at the near register was a young man, 19 or 20, with a name tag that said Marcus, and the particular look of someone who had been on his feet for 4 hours and was counting the minutes to his break. There was one other customer in the store that Dorothy could see, a woman in a red coat near the produce section examining pears. Dorothy did not stop at the produce. She did not stop at the dairy. She walked with her eyes on the middle distance and her purpose held close, and she went to the back of the store where the discount rack lived, a wire shelf near the bread aisle with a hand-lettered sign above it that said Manager's Specials in black marker. The shelf held 2 dented cans of soup, a box of pasta with a torn corner, and nothing else. The breadbasket beside it was empty. Dorothy stood there for a moment and looked at the empty basket. Then she walked to the bread aisle and stood in front of the full-price bread and looked at the prices. There was a white sandwich loaf for $3.79. There was a wheat loaf for $4.12. There were specialty breads above that, thick sliced sourdoughs and multi-grain things in paper bags that she didn't look at because looking at them would only make things harder. She picked up the white loaf. She looked at the price sticker. She put it back. She picked it up again. She held it for a long moment with both hands, the way you hold something you are not sure you have the right to keep. Then she walked to the front of the store and got in line behind the woman in the red coat who had decided on 2 pears and a small container of yogurt, and Dorothy set the bread on the belt and stood there and waited. The woman in the red coat finished and left. Marcus scanned the bread. The total appeared on the small screen facing Dorothy, $3.79, plus tax $3.99. She had $5.83. She could pay for the bread. She could pay for the bread and walk back out of the store with $1.84 and go home and make sandwiches with nothing in them and call that dinner, and tomorrow she could figure out tomorrow. She had done worse. She had gotten through worse. She told herself this while she opened her wallet. Then she looked at the bread again. 1 loaf, 2 children, 2 days until Friday. She thought about Grace eating her half of a sandwich tonight and asking for more, the way she always asked for more. Not with greed, but with the simple honesty of a 5-year-old body that needed fuel and didn't understand why there wasn't any. She thought about Owen pretending he wasn't hungry so Dorothy would give his second half to his sister. She closed her wallet. She looked at Marcus. He was watching her with the careful, neutral expression of someone who had been trained to be patient with customers and was currently being patient. His eyes were kind. He was young enough that they were still naturally kind before the world had done much to them. Dorothy opened her mouth. She stopped. She looked down at the counter. She had not planned to say this. She had practiced the whole drive over not saying this. She had told herself that she would simply pay for the bread and leave and figure out the rest later. But the bread was $3.99, and the loaf was not enough. And she was 67 years old, and she was tired. She was so deeply tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and she looked back up at Marcus, and she said it. Do you have any expired bread in the back, maybe? For my grandchildren. Anything marked down past what's on the shelf. The words came out smaller than she'd intended. She said them again, a little louder, because Marcus's face had gone very still, and he hadn't moved. Anything past date that you might have set aside. I just thought if there was something. She stopped talking. She pressed her lips together. She looked at the counter. She did not hear the bell above the door. She did not hear the heavy footsteps on the linoleum, unhurried the footsteps of a man who moved at his own pace because his own pace was the only one that had ever served him. She did not hear the quiet sound of a man getting in line behind her or the particular stillness that settled over a room when a man of a certain size and a certain presence walked into it. She heard the coffee can. It was a large can of black coffee, the kind you buy when you live alone and drink it strong. It came down on the counter beside her elbow with a sound like a single low note, not loud, not aggressive, just present, solid, like a period at the end of a sentence. Dorothy turned. She saw the beard first. Full and dark with silver, working through it, the kind of beard that had been there long enough to be part of the man's face rather than something added to it. She saw the vest, black leather worn soft with years, the kind of worn that meant something. She saw the patches on the chest, Iron Cross MC, and the rocker below it that said Tennessee, and the other patches she didn't know the meaning of, but understood instinctively were a language. A biography written in thread and cloth. She saw his eyes last. Dark eyes set deep, the kind of eyes that had been in a lot of rooms and learned what to do in all of them. He was looking at her, not with pity and not with judgment and not with the particular discomfort that people who don't know what to do with need sometimes wear on their faces like a mask. He was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have recognized, as if he had seen her before, not her specifically, but the exact shape of what she was standing in, as if he knew the name of this. Her face went red from her collar to her hairline. She reached for the bread. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry. I'll just..." She started to pull the bread back toward herself, some instinct to gather her things and go to get small and get out. "I didn't mean to hold up the line. I'll just..." "Ma'am." His voice was deeper than she expected. Not loud, not demanding. It had the quality of something that didn't need to be loud because it was used to being heard anyway. Leave the bread where it is. Dorothy's hand stilled on the loaf. Marcus, the man looked at the young cashier. She's not done shopping. Ring what she has and wait. Marcus blinked. Sir, she said she only has... She's not done shopping, the man said again, with exactly the same weight as the first time. Not angrier, just the same. The kind of steady that doesn't need to repeat itself a second time, but will because the first time it's always possible the other person didn't understand. Marcus understood. The man looked back at Dorothy. She had not moved. Her hands were still on the bread and her eyes were on the counter, and her face was the color of a woman who wanted to be invisible and had just failed at it in front of a stranger. Ma'am, the man said, look at me. She didn't. Look at me, please. She looked at him. Something in his face was not what she had expected. She had expected something rougher. The beard and the vest and the patches had prepared her for something rougher. What she saw instead was something that had already passed through rough and come out the other side. Something that had been broken and reset and broken again and was still here, still standing, still moving forward. Not soft, not hard, steady, like a post driven deep enough that the weather doesn't move it anymore. There's no expired bread here, he said. Not for you, not today. You and I are going to walk back through this store, and you're going to pick out what you need, and I'm going to pay for it, and we're not going to make a thing of it. Is that all right with you? Dorothy opened her mouth. Nothing came out. It's not charity, he said before she could find the word she was reaching for. It's groceries. People buy groceries every day. Today I'm buying yours. That's all this is. I can't let you do that, she said. Her voice was very small. You can, he said, and you will, because you came in here for your grandchildren, and what you came in here for isn't enough, and you know it, and I know it, and the only question is whether we're going to pretend otherwise. He said it plainly without anger and without softness, the way you say things that are simply true. Marcus, get her a cart. Marcus moved. He was already around the counter with a cart before Dorothy had fully processed what was happening, and he set it in front of her and stepped back and looked more relieved than he had any reason to look, the relief of a young man who had been handed an impossible situation and then immediately had it taken off his hands by someone who knew what to do with it. The man extended his hand. My name is Jax. Dorothy looked at the hand, then she took it. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who meant it but didn't need to prove anything. Dorothy, she said. Dorothy, what do your grandchildren like to eat? She tried to answer. The first attempt produced no sound at all. She cleared her throat. My grandson, Owen, he's 8. He likes peanut butter and soup. He'd eat chicken soup every day if I let him. She paused. My granddaughter Grace is 5. She likes. She stopped. Something was climbing up her throat that she did not have room for, something that had been waiting in a tight place for a long time and had decided that this of all moments was the moment to try to come out. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her shoulders moved. Jax did not touch her. He did not step closer. He did not say anything at all. He simply stood 3 feet away with his arms at his sides and his beard tipped down, and he gave her 45 seconds, which was exactly what she needed and not a second more or less. When she lowered her hand, her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. Strawberries, she said. Grace likes strawberries. They're out of season, but she doesn't care. We'll find strawberries, Jax said. Come on. He walked behind her, not in front, not beside, in a way that crowded. Behind a half step, so she was leading, even though neither of them was pretending she knew where they were going. She pushed the cart, and he walked, and she went to the bread aisle first, because the bread was already there in her mind, and she reached for the white loaf. 2, Jack said. She looked at him. 1 for sandwiches, he said. 1 for toast. Kids eat a lot of toast. She put the white loaf in the cart. He picked up the wheat loaf and put it in beside it without asking. They went to dairy. She reached for the small container of milk. He picked up the gallon. Kids drink a gallon a week easy, he said. At that age, they drink it like it's water. She started to protest, and he said, Dorothy, with a patience that had nothing weary in it, and she put the small container back and let the gallon go in the cart. Butter. She reached for the store brand. He handed it to her without comment. Cheese, she reached for the smallest block, and he added a larger one beside it. For grilled cheese, he said, Grilled cheese is a Tuesday. You want to be able to make grilled cheese on a Tuesday without thinking about it. She almost said something to that. She decided not to. They went to the soup aisle and he let her pick, and she picked chicken noodle, the kind Owen liked, and he put 3 cans in the cart. He added tomato without asking, and when she looked at him, he said, "Tomato soup with grilled cheese is a Tuesday too." She found herself almost smiling, which felt strange and not unwelcome. They went to the meat counter. He bought a whole chicken. He bought a pound of ground beef. He bought a pack of hot dogs because he looked at her face when she passed the hot dogs, and he could read what a woman's face did when she walked past something her grandchildren would have been happy to see. She didn't say a word about the hot dogs. He put them in the cart. They went to the cereal aisle. She picked the store brand, which was sensible and adequate and cost $2 less. He put the name brand next to it. She looked at him. "For Saturdays," he said. "Saturdays should have something extra, something that didn't require a coupon." She let both boxes stay in the cart. "Produce." She found the strawberries. They were greenhouse strawberries, pale at the tips, not the deep red ones from summer, but they were there. She held the container and looked at it. "She'll know they're not as good," Dorothy said. "She's 5, Jack said. "She'll be happy they're pink." Dorothy put them in the cart. By the time they got back to the front of the store, the cart was full in a way that Dorothy's cart had not been full in 8 months. There were groceries in it that she had forgotten the feeling of buying. Name brand things, things with no dents and no markdown stickers. Things she had stopped looking at in October when the hotel where she'd been doing part-time breakfast prep had cut her shifts from 22 hours a week to 9. She looked at the cart and felt something that was not quite shame and not quite gratitude, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. There were 4 other people in the store. An older man reading the label on a can of beans had stopped reading the label. He was standing very still with the can in both hands. A woman with a toddler on her hip had stopped at the end of the aisle, and the toddler was pointing at Jax's vest, and she was ignoring the toddler. The woman in the red coat had come back in, apparently, and was standing near the exit with 2 more pairs she probably didn't need, and her eyes on Dorothy with an expression that was doing its best to be private. Marcus scanned everything slowly. He was being careful in the way that young people are careful when they are in the presence of something they understand is important, but don't fully understand why. The total came up on the screen, $171.44. Jax reached into the back pocket of his jeans and brought out a worn leather wallet, the kind of wallet that had been in that pocket so long it had taken on the shape of the hip it lived against. He counted out $200 in bills, not hurrying, and laid them on the counter. "Keep what's left on her account," he said to Marcus. "Anything she comes in for before next Friday, you take it off that. When it's gone, call me." He took a receipt from the counter, turned it over, and wrote a phone number on the back in pencil and handwriting that was large and deliberate, the handwriting of a man who didn't write often, but meant it when he did. He slid the receipt across to Marcus. Marcus took it with both hands. Jax bagged the groceries himself. Dorothy reached in to help, and he moved the bag gently out of her reach. "I've got it," he said, not dismissive, just clear. He bagged everything with the efficiency of a man who was used to doing things that needed doing without commentary, and then he lifted the bags, 3 in each hand, and walked toward the door. "The cart," Dorothy started. "Leave it." She walked beside him through the automatic doors and into the parking lot where the low sun had gotten lower, and the air had the particular cold sharpnesses of November evenings that feel like the first real announcement of winter. She fumbled for her keys. "Which car?" he asked. She pointed. The gray sedan was old enough that its make had stopped mattering. He walked to it. She unlocked the trunk. He loaded the bags in carefully, not throwing, not dropping, setting each one down with a consideration that a man buying groceries for a stranger had no obligation to show, and showed anyway. He closed the trunk with a quiet click. Then he stepped back. In the backseat of the car, Owen and Grace were watching through the window with very large eyes. Owen's eyes went from the groceries to the man and back to the groceries. Grace had both hands on the glass. Jax looked at them. He raised one hand. Not a wave exactly, more the way a person acknowledges 2 people who are watching them from a window. Grace pressed her palm flat against the glass. He nodded at her. "Get them home," he said to Dorothy. "It's cold." "Thank you," Dorothy said. She hadn't planned to say anything else. Then she said, I don't know what you're owed. I don't know how to." "You're not owed anything," he said. "That's not why I'm here." He looked at her with the same steady clarity as before, unhurried, patient, like a man who had said something true and was prepared to wait while the other person caught up to it. Drive home safe, Dorothy. He walked to his bike. She hadn't noticed it when she parked. It was a Harley older, dark blue, parked 2 spaces down and angled out. He put on his helmet. He started the engine. The sound of it was low and serious, and then it smoothed out into something that was almost quiet. He didn't look back. Dorothy stood in the parking lot until he was out of the lot and onto the road, and the sound of the bike had faded into the general noise of the evening. Then she got in her car. She adjusted the mirror. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, the lines around her eyes, the white that had come into her hair. In the 8 months since March, the particular look that grief gives a face that nothing afterward quite undoes. She looked at herself, and then she looked at the road. "Grandma," Owen said from the back seat. "Who was that?" "A man from the store," Dorothy said. "He bought our groceries." Dorothy put the car in reverse. "Yes. Why?" She thought about this for a moment, looking over her shoulder to check the lot behind her. "Because he could," she said finally. "Some people, when they can do a good thing, they do it." Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he had a cool jacket. Dorothy made a sound that was almost a laugh. She pulled out of the lot and onto Route 41 and pointed the car toward home. And behind her, the sun finished going down over the parking lot of Family Foods, and the store's automatic doors opened and closed on the evening air. And Marcus stood at his register for a long moment, looking at the phone number on the receipt, and then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. She didn't hear the engines until she was already inside. She had put 2 bags of groceries on the kitchen counter and was reaching for the third when she heard them. It wasn't loud. It was a sound like weather, not a storm, not a threat, just the organized sound of many machines running in the same direction. It came down her street and stopped. The sound of engines idling and then cutting one at a time like a long sentence ending. She went to the living room window. In the 8 months since March, Dorothy Holden had gotten used to the particular quiet of her street. Sycamore Lane was a residential block in a part of Clarksville that had been built in the 1970s and had been slowly, gently declining ever since. Not catastrophically, but steadily, the way things decline when money goes elsewhere for long enough. The houses were small and close together, and the lawns were modest, and the street was usually quiet by 5 o'clock, especially now that it was cold. The neighbors kept to themselves in the good way, the way that meant they were there if you needed them, but didn't presume you did. The motorcycles were parked in a line along the curb on both sides of her driveway. She counted them. She counted them twice. 34 motorcycles, most of them Harleys of various ages and configurations, polished in the particular way that men polish things they are proud of. The engines were off now. The men were standing in a loose group on the sidewalk across from her front walk. Not in her yard, not on her steps, not crowding forward. Just standing, waiting. They were in vests, most of them. Iron Cross MC patches on black leather or black denim. There were big men and medium men, and one man who was older than the rest, white-haired, with the measured stillness of someone who had been in 1,000 situations and had stopped being surprised by any of them. They were not looking at her window. They were looking at the street, the trees, each other, their boots, giving her the privacy of her own curtain while she figured out what she was looking at. Jax was standing at the bottom of her front steps. Dorothy stood at the window for a long time. She was 67 years old. She had lived alone, or what passed for alone, with 2 children in her care for 8 months. She had learned in those 8 months to be careful with doors. She had learned to look before opening. She had learned that the world outside her front door was not a world that moved toward her with things that were for her. She looked at the men on the sidewalk. She looked at the way they were standing, not aggressive, not casual in the way that conceals aggression, just present, just waiting. She went to the door. She opened it 3 inches. "Ma'am," Jack said. He was standing at the bottom of the steps with his hands in his jacket pockets and his vest on his shoulders, and his voice at exactly the register of a man who understood he was standing on someone else's porch and what that meant. "I'm sorry to come back without calling ahead. I know how this looks." "How does it look?" Dorothy said. He considered this briefly. "Like a lot," he said. "Like more than you asked for and more than you expected." "I know that, but I want to ask you something, and then I want to ask if I can come in. You can say no to either one. Either way, nobody's upset." Dorothy held the door and waited. At the store, Jack said, "You asked for bread past date. That's not a question a woman asks because she's had one bad week. That's a question that comes from somewhere else. Am I wrong? She didn't answer. I'm not here to take anything from you, he said. I'm not here to make you feel a certain way about it. I went home and I sat down and I couldn't sit. So I called some people and here we are. He looked past her, not inside the house, but at the door frame, at the porch, at the dead bulb in the fixture above her head. Then he looked back at her. I'd like to come in. My brothers can wait out here. Just me. Dorothy looked at the men on the sidewalk. Every one of them was still looking at anything except her. She opened the door. Jax came in. He stepped into the entryway and stopped. He unzipped his vest, not asked to, not offered to, just did it, and shrugged it off and folded it with the patches face in and laid it across the back of the nearest chair. He did this carefully and without explanation, and Dorothy understood it was a kind of translation. He was making himself smaller in her house. Not smaller than he was, but smaller than the thing he represented, which was the thing her hallway was not big enough to hold. He stood in the entryway and looked around, not snooping, not browsing, the way a man looks who is trying to understand what he's walked into. Dorothy knew what he was seeing. She'd seen it herself every morning coming out of her bedroom, the living room with the card table and folding chair she'd bought at Goodwill because the couch that had been Danny and Melissa's had gone with Melissa to Phoenix. The laundry baskets along the wall that held the children's clothes because the dresser was in the spare room where she'd stacked the boxes that had come from Danny's house and that she hadn't been able to open yet. The thermostat on the wall that she'd had set at 59 since October, because 59 was cold, but the difference between 59 and 65 was $16 a month, and $16 a month was the difference between other things. He saw the thermostat. He didn't say anything. He came to the kitchen doorway. Dorothy stood with her arms crossed, not defensively, but in the way of a woman who was holding herself together by will and was conserving heat by volume. On the counter, 2 grocery bags half unpacked. On the stove, nothing yet. In the refrigerator, which she had left open a half-inch so the light was still on, the new groceries she just brought home sat alongside 3 eggs and a jar of mustard and a container of the kids' leftovers from 2 nights ago that she'd been stretching. Owen appeared at the end of the hallway. He stopped when he saw Jax. He was wearing socks that didn't match and a sweatshirt that had belonged to Danny and was too big for him in a way that made Dorothy's chest ache every time she saw it. "Hey, buddy," Jax said. His voice went quieter with the child in the room. "I'm a friend of your grandma's. My name is Jax. It's a nickname because my real name is kind of embarrassing." Owen looked at him with the long, unblinking assessment of an 8-year-old who has learned that the adults in his life are not always as certain as they pretend to be. "What's your real name?" "I'll tell you when you're older," Jax said. "How old?" 40 sounds about right. Owen processed this. The corner of his mouth moved. "That's a long time." "It is," Jax agreed, "but some things are worth waiting for." Owen looked at his grandmother. She gave him a small nod that meant it was all right. He disappeared back down the hallway, probably to report to Grace, who was almost certainly listening from 3 feet away. Jax turns back to Dorothy. "Tell me what happened," he said. "Not before March, after." She started to say it was complicated. She stopped. It wasn't complicated. It was just heavy, which was different. She told him about the breakfast prep job at the Comfort Suites, $10.50 an hour. 5 a.m. to 11 a.m., 4 days a week. Not enough, but something. She had structured her life around because Owen's school started at 7:30, and the neighbor's daughter, a young woman named Beth, who needed the money, could get them there on her way to work. She told him how the hotel had cut her to 2 shifts when the summer convention season ended, and she'd asked Linda Foss, the floor manager who handled scheduling, whether there was anything else, and Linda had said no with the particular flatness of a woman who didn't believe the question deserved a better answer. She told him about the bills, Danny's hospital bills that his insurance had only partially covered and that were now technically in default. The property tax he'd owed on the small house in Ashland City that had to be paid before the estate could settle, and that was sitting in a lawyer's office waiting for money Dorothy didn't have. The car payment she'd been 2 months behind on since June. The utilities she'd been juggling, the electricity this month, the gas next month, the phone last month. She told him about being a secretary for 22 years. Family law office in Springfield, Ohio. She'd been good at it. She'd been organized and precise, and she had understood how to run an office, the scheduling, The billing, the files, the follow-up, all of it. She'd retired at 63 because Danny had asked her to come to Tennessee because Melissa was pregnant with Grace and Danny wanted his mother close. And Dorothy had said yes because she was 63 and her husband Roy had been gone for 4 years and she was ready to be somewhere that meant something. Roy, 41 years, heart attack in his sleep, age 66. She had woken up in the same bed they'd shared since 1982, and Roy was simply not there anymore in the way that some things simply stopped being. She had learned to be without Roy before she had finished learning how to be without Roy, which was the thing that no one told you about grief, that you had to keep moving through it at the same time that you were trying to understand it, and the understanding always came too late. She stopped talking. The kitchen was quiet, the refrigerator hummed. Through the window, the sky had gone the particular deep blue that happened just before full dark in November, the last good color of the day. "Jax," she said, "what exactly are you proposing?" He looked at her steadily. "I have some brothers outside who are good at things. Bull out there, he was an electrician for 25 years before he retired. Sparks, the younger one in the green jacket, he does heating and cooling. Your porch light is out, and your house is 59 degrees, and it's November." He paused. "I've also got 2 coolers in a truck out there with enough food for a week and a fire starting kit, because I saw you don't have any firewood and you've got a fireplace." Dorothy looked at the fireplace. She had looked at it every evening for 6 weeks and thought about how much warmer the room would be if there were a fire in it and not done anything about it because firewood was money. "I don't want to feel like," she started. "You won't," he said. "These men aren't here because they feel sorry for you. They're here because I called them and they came because that's what we do. They're going to do some work and eat some food and go home. You don't owe them a handshake." "Why did you call them?" Jax was quiet for a moment. "I had a wife," he said. "Her name was Carol. We met when I was 26. She was 22. She was bright and funny, and she laughed at everything, the kind of woman who could make a room feel like summer just by being in it." He stopped. He looked at the kitchen window at the dark outside it. "She had a bad situation before me. A man who hit her. She thought she'd gotten out of it. She had for a while. Then he found her again." Dorothy was very still. "She went to a shelter," Jack said. "The shelter was full. She went to her church. The pastor told her to be patient and pray. She called the police twice. The second time they told her there was nothing they could do without proof of threat. The third time she didn't call anyone. She went to the emergency room." He stopped again. He pressed his jaw together and then released it. "She died on a Thursday. She was 31 years old. I had been on a run 3 states away, and I came home, and she was gone." The refrigerator hummed. "Nobody helped her," Jack said. "She reached for help, and nobody held out a hand. And I made a promise, as standing next to where they buried her, that if I ever came across someone reaching, and nobody else was holding out their hand, I would hold out mine." He looked at Dorothy. At a grocery store, a woman asked the cashier for expired bread for her grandchildren, and every other person in that line looked somewhere else. I'm not built to look somewhere else. That's all this is. Dorothy's eyes were wet. She didn't try to do anything about it. "Carol," she said, "she sounds like she was good." "She was," Jack said, "the best person I knew." Dorothy looked at the folded vest on the chair, at the patches face down, at this man who had come into her kitchen and told her a true thing without requiring anything from her for the telling. She looked at him for a long time. "Tell your brothers to come in," she said. Jax walked to the front door. He opened it and stood in the doorway for a moment, and whatever gesture he made, Dorothy couldn't see it from the kitchen. It was enough. She heard footsteps on the front walk, measured and purposeful, not rushing. Then her front door was full of men with their arms full of things. They came in quietly. The one called Bull, a large man in his early 60s with a shaved head and the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades doing precise work with the large hands, went straight to the electrical panel in the hallway without being directed. Sparks, younger, broad across the shoulders, carrying a toolbox, stopped to ask Dorothy where the furnace was. 2 of the men went to the kitchen and began unpacking the coolers with the coordinated ease of people who had done this together before. A man Dorothy didn't know the name of, bearded with a cast on his left forearm that he was apparently ignoring, carried an armful of firewood to the fireplace and went back for more. Another man knelt down in the middle of the living room floor, and Grace appeared from the hallway and stood 3 feet away and stared at him. He was maybe 40, with a wide-open face and a beard that was getting started but hadn't quite committed yet. He looked up at Grace. "Hi," he said. Grace held up the strawberry container. Dorothy had apparently left it on the counter, and Grace had found it. "You like strawberries," the man said. Grace turned the container around in her hands. "My mom doesn't buy them in winter." "Your grandma bought them today," the man said. Grace thought about this. She sat down on the floor across from him. He sat cross-legged. She sat cross-legged. They looked at each other with the uncomplicated mutual interest of people who have nothing to prove. "My name's Dax," the man said. "I'm Grace," Grace said. She held up the container. "Do you want one?" "I would love one," Dax said. "Thank you." Dorothy stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her living room fill up with men who were fixing things she had stopped looking at because she couldn't fix them herself. She watched the light above the fireplace come on when Bull did something at the panel she didn't understand. She watched the first finger of flame catch the newspaper Sparks had tucked under the logs and grow upward into something real. She felt through the floor. The particular vibration of the furnace in the basement kicking on for the first time in 6 weeks, a sound like something waking up. The big bald man, Pop someone had called him, was unwrapping plates at the kitchen counter with the slow, careful movements of a man who had been useful with his hands for many decades and knew that useful and gentle were not opposites. He looked at Dorothy over his shoulder. "Have you eaten today, ma'am?" he said. "I had some crackers," Dorothy said. Pop looked at her in the way that men of a certain age look at people who have said something that reveals more than they meant it to. He turned back to the food without comment. 15 minutes later, there was a card table in the dining room that had appeared from somewhere Dorothy couldn't account for. And on it, there was enough food for 12 people, a pot of chicken stew that had been warm in a cooler cornbread in a cast iron pan, green beans with bacon, a container of potato salad, and a layer cake with white frosting that one of the younger men carried in as carefully as if it contained something alive. Dorothy stood in the kitchen doorway and could not account for how this had happened. Her house, which had been cold and quiet and half empty an hour ago, was warm and full and doing something she hadn't thought to ask it to do. It sounded like a house that had people in it. It smelled like food. Through the living room doorway, she could see a fire in the fireplace for the first time since she'd moved in. Jack stood beside her in the doorway. He was looking at his men and at the children. Grace had abandoned the strawberries and was demonstrating something with her hands to Dax, who was watching with complete attention and at the table at the food. "Sit down," he said to Dorothy. "Let them feed you." She started to say something about the dishes. He looked at her. She stopped. She sat down. Owen sat on her left. Grace came running and climbed into the chair on her right, dragging Dax along behind her because she had apparently decided he was attached to the strawberries, and the strawberries were coming to the table. Pop served the plates. He put more food on Dorothy's plate than she thought she could eat, and she ate every bite. I saw. Jack sat across from her. He ate and didn't make speeches and didn't explain anything and didn't look at her as if she were something to be assessed or admired. Owen ate 3 pieces of cornbread. Grace got potato salad in her hair and noticed halfway through the meal and wiped it out with her sleeve before anyone could say anything about it. At some point in the middle of all of it, Dorothy looked up from her plate and found that her face was wet. She hadn't noticed it starting. She didn't make a sound. She just sat at her own dining table with their grandchildren, eating on either side of her in a warm room with a fire burning, and water ran down her face into the food on her plate, and nobody at the table acted like they'd noticed, and she was grateful for that more than she could have said. When the plates were mostly empty, Jax leaned forward on the table. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and then I'm going to leave you with your grandchildren and let you have your evening." "Is that all right?" Dorothy nodded. "My brother," Jack said, "not a club brother, blood brother, Ray. He runs an auto shop about 35 miles east of here. He's been trying to find someone to handle his books for 8 months. He is a good mechanic and an absolutely terrible businessman, and his financial records are what happens when a good mechanic doesn't know anything about financial records, which is to say they are not records so much as a general agreement that money has changed hands at various points." Dorothy almost smiled. Almost. "He pays $18 an hour," Jack said. "Health insurance after 90 days. Office hours 8 to 3:30 5 days a week, so you'd be home when the kids get off the school bus. He's been talking to people who don't know what they're looking at, and he knows it, and he's got a particular look in his eyes that a man gets when he's drowning and isn't going to say so out loud." He looked at her. "You spent 22 years running an office. That's not bookkeeping exactly, but it's close enough that a woman who ran a legal office for 22 years will have the place organized inside of 2 weeks, and Ray will know it the second she walks in the door. Dorothy looked at her hands on the table. Friday morning, Jack said, 9 o'clock. I'll send you the address tonight. You go, you meet him, you see what you think. If it's not the right fit, you walk out and we find something else. But I'd bet on you. She looked up. Why? He seemed to consider this. Because you came into that store with $5.83 and two kids in the car, and instead of putting it on a credit card you couldn't pay, or writing a check that wouldn't clear, you went to the back shelf and looked for what was already written down. That's the thinking of someone who knows how to manage what's there. That's a skill. Ray needs that skill, and you need steady hours. He paused. It's a practical arrangement. That's all. The fire in the next room popped and settled. Grace had climbed out of her chair and was sitting on the floor near the fireplace with Dax, who was showing her something with a piece of string he'd found in his jacket pocket. Owen had gone to Bull, who was at the electrical panel still doing something, and was watching Bull work with the particular intensity of a boy who was deciding in real time whether he wanted to be an electrician. Jack stood. He picked up his vest from the chair. He put it on, and Dorothy watched the patches come back to his shoulders, and the man who had sat at her table became again the president of a motorcycle club, which was not a different man, but was a different face of the same man, and both of them had been kind to her tonight. Lock the door behind me, he said, not because of us, just because it's late. He walked to the front door. The men in the house began to move tools back into boxes, coats back on the last of the food cupboard, and put in her refrigerator. The fire screen moved in front of the fireplace. They came past her one by one, and each of them nodded or said something quiet, and none of them asked for anything. Pop shook her hand with both of his, which is how men of a certain age shake hands with women they want to tell something to without finding the words. Dax told Grace the piece of string was for her, and she immediately put it in her pocket. Jax was the last one. He stopped in the doorway. Friday 9 o'clock, he said. Text me if anything comes up. The number's on the card by your phone. He pulled the door closed. Dorothy stood in her hallway and listened to the sound of 34 engines starting, not all at once, but in sequence, one by one down the row, until the sound gathered itself into something cohesive and then began to move down Sycamore Lane, away from her house, quieter. Quieter gone. The house was warm. The fire was burning. The furnace was running. There was food in the refrigerator and food on the table, and both the children were in the living room. Owen lying on his stomach in front of the fire, Grace sitting up beside him with a piece of string in her hand, and neither of them was asking when dinner would be ready, because dinner had already happened and they were full. Dorothy locked the front door. She turned around. She stood in her own hallway in her own house in the quiet, and she looked at what the evening had done to it. Then she sat down on the floor with her back against the front door, and she put her face in her hands, and she let herself feel everything she had been carrying since March. She let it come. She let it move through her the way grief has to move all the way through, and she sat on the floor of her hallway for a long time before she stood up and went to check on the children. They were asleep by the fire. She got a blanket from the closet, a real blanket, not a couch cushion, and covered them and left them where they were because they were warm and they were full and they were sleeping, and those three things together were more than they'd had in months. She went to the kitchen and picked up the card from beside the phone. A phone number in pencil, large, deliberate handwriting. She turned it over. She looked at it for a while. Then she put it in the pocket of her cardigan close to her chest and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the warm dark of her house. Friday, she thought, 9 o'clock. She went to bed. For the first time since March, she slept through the night. Friday came with a gray sky and the smell of wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney and a light frost on Dorothy's windshield that she scraped off with a credit card she'd been keeping in her glove compartment for that purpose since the ice scraper broke in January. She wore the navy blouse she'd bought at a church rummage sale in August and told herself was for special occasions. She wore her good slacks, the dark ones that still held a crease if she hung them right. She wore the small pearl earrings that had been a 35th anniversary gift from Roy and that she had not worn since his funeral, because wearing them after the funeral had felt wrong, and then wearing them after Danny's funeral had felt wrong too, and now she put them in because she needed something that felt like herself at her best. And the pearls were the closest thing she had to that. She drove 35 miles east with the radio off and her hands steady on the wheel. Monroe's Auto and Service sat at the edge of a small town called Cedar Falls that existed mostly as a post office, a hardware store, a diner, and the garage. The garage was bigger than she'd expected. 8 bays, 3 hydraulic lifts, a glass-fronted waiting room with plastic chairs and a coffee maker and a television mounted in the corner showing local news. There were 4 vehicles inside that she could see from the lot, a lifted pickup on one of the lifts, 2 sedans in various states of disassembly, and a motorcycle frame on a stand near the back that somebody had stripped down to its essential geometry. She parked, she sat for a moment, then she went in. Ray Monroe was waiting at the counter in the waiting room. He was slender where Jack's was solid with the same dark eyes and the same quality of steadiness in them, though on Ray it came across as someone who had learned to be calm, because chaos was the default condition of his working life, and calm was the only productive response to it. He was 52, maybe 53, with a mechanic's hands knuckles enlarged, permanently stained at the cuticles with the kind of deep-set grease that only comes out partway, and a handshake that was firm and brief and expected nothing theatrical in return. "Mrs. Holden," he said, "I'm Ray. Jack said good things. Come on and see the office." The office was behind the waiting room. It was a room approximately the size of Dorothy's bathroom at home, with a desk and a computer and 2 filing cabinets and a printer, and enough paper stacked on every flat surface to reconstruct the complete written works of a mid-sized publishing house. There were receipts in a shoebox. There were invoices rubber-banded in groups that she could see on closer inspection had been organized by someone Ray, presumably who had understood the concept of organization without fully understanding the execution of it. The computer screen showed a spreadsheet with 43 tabs open along the bottom. Ray looked at the office with the expression of a man showing someone a thing he is slightly ashamed of. "I've been meaning to get it sorted," he said. "How long has it been like this?" Dorothy asked. "Define like this." "Any configuration of like this." He considered. "About 4 years," he said. Dorothy looked at the office for a long time. She walked in. She stood in the middle of it. She turned around slowly. She looked at the filing cabinets and the stacks and the shoebox and the screen with 43 tabs, and she looked at all of it the way a woman looks at something she knows how to do. $18 an hour, she said. "That's right. Health insurance after 90 days. Blue Cross, it's decent. 8 to 3:30. Unless something comes up, which it does. But if something comes up, I'll call you ahead, and you can decide. I'll need 2 weeks to get it organized before we can talk about what system we're using going forward," Dorothy said. "During those 2 weeks, I'll also be learning what you have and what you need, so I can't promise the books will be accurate during that period, but I can promise they will be accurate after." Ray looked at her. Something settled in his face, something that had been holding tension let go of it. "When can you start?" he said. "Monday," Dorothy said. She started Monday. She arrived at 7:50 and parked in the same spot as Friday and went in and got the coffee started before anyone else arrived, because a working office ran on coffee, and the coffee maker in the waiting room had been making a sound that suggested it was close to retirement, and she had brought her own a 12-cup machine she'd found in Danny's boxes the previous week and cleaned and tested on Saturday morning. She brought it in a canvas bag. She set it up on the filing cabinet. She made coffee. When Ray came in at 8, the office already smelled like something that intended to be productive. "You brought a coffee maker," Ray said. "Yours is dying," Dorothy said. "I know," Ray said. "I've been meaning to—" "I know," Dorothy said. She opened the shoebox. For 2 weeks, she sorted and cross-referenced and built a system that started with what Ray had and worked backward into what it should have been and forward into what it needed to become. She came in at 7:50 every morning, and she left at 3:25 to make sure she was home when the school bus came. And between those hours, she worked the way she had worked at the family law office in Springfield for 22 years, which was to say thoroughly without drama, and with a clear sense of what needed doing in what order. By the end of the second week, she had found 14 months of unbilled service charges, 3 vendor payments that had been made twice, 1 significant discrepancy in the parts account that turned out to be an honest mistake, and not a dishonest one, and a tax situation that she could not fully assess, but that was going to require the attention of an accountant and possibly also the grace of God. She made a list and brought it to Ray on a Friday afternoon. He read the list at his desk while she sat across from him with her hands folded. He read it twice. He set it down. He looked at her. Jax told me you were good, he said. Jax was generous, Dorothy said. No, Ray said Jax is precise. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He looked at the list again. How much of this can you fix? All of the billing, all of the accounting, all of the vendor management, Dorothy said. The tax situation requires a CPA. I can organize everything so that when you bring in a CPA, they'll have a clear picture in half the time, which means you'll pay them for half the hours. Ray nodded slowly, the nod of a man doing arithmetic in his head and finding the numbers favorable. I'm going to bump you to $20 an hour, he said, starting today. Dorothy had expected this at some point in the next month. She had not expected it in the second week. She kept her face professional. Thank you, she said. You're going to save me more in the next quarter than your salary cost me in 6 months, Ray said. It's not generosity, it's math. He picked up the list again. Tell me about the vendor situation. Dorothy told him about the vendor situation. They sat in the office, which was no longer chaos, but was becoming something navigable. Files in the cabinets and folders on the desk, and a system on the computer that Dorothy had built herself and documented in a binder she'd labeled Operations in capital letters, because capital letters had always seemed to her like the appropriate register for anything that needed to be done correctly. And they talked about the business for an hour, and Dorothy answered every question he asked and asked several of her own, and by the time she left at 3:25, she felt something she had not felt in 8 months. Useful. She felt useful. She felt like a person who had a place to be in the morning and a reason for being there. And the feeling was so simple and so fundamental that she had not realized until now how much of her had been missing it. She got in her car. She sat for a moment. She thought about Roy, who had always told her that her mind was the thing he'd fallen in love with first, before her face, before her laugh, before anything. She thought about Danny, who had asked her once when he was 12 why she didn't do something bigger with herself. And she had told him that running an office well was not a small thing, and he had thought about it and nodded and said he guessed that was true. She sat with both of them for a moment, the way she did sometimes when something happened that she would have wanted to tell them about. She thought about the 22 years at the law office in Springfield. She had arrived there at 41 the year Owen's father was born. Danny had been a newborn, and Roy had just made partner at his engineering firm. And they had been the particular kind of busy that young parents with two demanding careers are the good kind of busy, the kind where you fall into bed at night, feeling full rather than empty. The law office had been 3 attorneys and a paralegal in a practice that handled family matters, divorces and custody arrangements and estate planning, and the occasional adoption. And what the attorneys needed was someone to hold it together so they could do their work. And Dorothy had held it together for 22 years. She had learned in those years what it looked like when families broke apart. She had filed the paperwork. She had answered the phones. She had sat across from people in the waiting room who were in the middle of the worst things that had ever happened to them, and she had handed them the forms and explained the process and brought them coffee, because sometimes the only thing you could do for a person in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to them was bring them something warm and let them know that the process had steps and the steps could be walked through. She had not imagined in those 22 years that she would one day be the person in the waiting room. She had not imagined losing Roy. She had not imagined losing Danny. She had not imagined sitting at a kitchen table in Tennessee counting coins while her grandchildren ate crackers they had found under a car seat. Life did not ask your permission before it rearranged itself around you. It simply rearranged, and then it waited to see whether you would rearrange yourself to match. She had been rearranging herself since March, slowly and perfectly, with considerable resistance from her own habits and instincts. But she had been doing it. She thought about Jax's face in the grocery store, the steadiness of it, the quality of a man who had been watching for something and recognized it when it arrived. She thought about what it cost to carry a promise for 20 years and still pick it up every day and carry it forward. She thought about the kind of love that makes a person into that. Then she drove home. The weeks moved forward. Owen started eating breakfast every morning without being reminded, which was new. Grace had stopped asking, where Mommy was not in the way of forgetting, but in the way of a child who had found a different anchor and was using it. Dorothy found a bed frame at a church sale for $8, and Beth's husband, who turned out to be good at that sort of thing, helped her get it upstairs. The dresser she'd been keeping in the spare room, Danny's old dresser, still with his smell in it, which she had not been ready to open for 8 months, She moved it to the kids' room on a Saturday afternoon when they were at a birthday party, and she opened the drawers one by one and sat on the edge of the mattress for a while before she lined the drawers with paper and started putting the children's clothes in them, and that was one of the harder things she did that year, and also one of the more necessary ones. The Iron Chris MC appeared every couple of weeks, never called ahead, never in large numbers. Dax came by on a Thursday and asked Owen if he wanted to see how a carburetor worked, and Owen did, and they spent 45 minutes in the driveway with a carburetor Dax had apparently brought in his jacket pocket for exactly this purpose. Bull dropped off a set of snow tires in November. Pop's wife, Norma, a woman Dorothy's age with white hair, and the manner of someone who had seen everything and filed it all under still manageable, appeared on a Sunday with a peach cobbler and sat in Dorothy's kitchen for 2 hours and talked about nothing consequential and consequential things in equal measure. And Dorothy found after she left that she had laughed twice, actually laughed, which she had not done in front of another adult since before March. She didn't call Jax. She didn't have occasion to call him. She had the number on the card in her cardigan pocket transferred now to the pocket of every cardigan she owned, and she held it there the way you hold something that makes you feel less alone without being the kind of thing you take out and look at. It was a Tuesday in the third week of January when Linda Foss made her move. In the weeks leading up to it, Dorothy had settled into a routine that she would not have recognized 2 months earlier. She woke at 6:15 and made coffee with the machine she'd brought from Danny's boxes, and she stood at the kitchen window while it brewed and watched the street outside come slowly into morning. Sycamore Lane in December and January had a particular quiet about it. The cold kept people inside, and the bare trees let you see further than you could in summer, all the way to the bend in the road where the street curved toward the elementary school. She had started to love that view. She had not expected to love anything about this house, which she had moved into out of necessity and without choosing, but she had come to love the morning light on the bare trees and the sound of Owen's alarm clock at 7, in Grace's particular way of waking up, which was to go from completely asleep to completely present in approximately 45 seconds. Appearing in the kitchen doorway, fully awake and ready to have opinions about everything. She drove to Monroe's at 7:50 and came home at 3:25, and in between she did work that she was good at and that she could see the results of, which was a form of satisfaction she had not realized she had been missing until it came back. Ray left her largely alone after the first week. He had the good sense to recognize that a person who knew what they were doing did not need to be supervised. And he expressed this by staying in his bays and asking her questions when he had them, and otherwise trusting her to handle the office the way she had decided it needed to be handled. This was in Dorothy's experience of workplaces over 22 years not common. She appreciated it more than she said. She went to the grocery store on Thursdays. She took the children to the library on Saturday mornings because Owen was a reader, and Grace was not yet, but was beginning to be interested in the pictures and in having things read to her aloud, which Dorothy did with patience and different voices for the different characters, because Grace required the different voices and would correct her if she forgot. She went to church on Sunday mornings, the small Methodist congregation 2 blocks from the house where she had started attending in October, because she needed something that was hers and hers alone, something outside the house and the children and the job, something that asked only that she show up and be still for an hour. The congregation was small and did not make a fuss over newcomers, which suited Dorothy perfectly. She sat in the same pew every week, 5th row from the front on the left side, and she was given the same quiet nod by the same people, and she gave it back, and nobody asked her how she was adjusting, because people who sit in the 5th pew week after week are clearly adjusting. Dorothy had been expecting something from Linda. Not specifically this, but something. Linda Foss was a woman who operated on a principle Dorothy had encountered before in offices and workplaces across 22 years. The principle that power exercised quietly was safer than power exercised openly, and that the best way to harm someone was to do it through a system that couldn't be blamed for having feelings about it. Dorothy had given 2 weeks' notice at the hotel in early December, professional and without elaboration, and Linda had accepted it with a smile that didn't involve her eyes. Dorothy had cleaned out her locker, returned her uniform, signed the standard departure paperwork, and left. She had thought in the car afterward that that was the end of it. She had not anticipated the phone call to the Department of Children's Services. She found out about it on a Tuesday morning when she got to Monroe's at 7:50 and found a card tucked under her windshield wiper. Department of Children's Services, County of Montgomery. A name and a number and a note that said, "Please call," regarding a home visit. Dorothy stood in the parking lot and held the card. Her breath was coming out in visible puffs in the cold morning air. She went inside, made the coffee, and sat at her desk for 5 minutes before she called. The caseworker's name was Ms. Pruitt, and she was professional and not unkind, and she explained that the department had received a complaint from an anonymous third party raising concerns about the home environment of two children in Dorothy's care. The complaint cited the presence of motorcycle club activity in and around the home, concerns about the stability of the primary caregiver's employment, and a general condition of possible neglect. Pruitt said that a home visit would be scheduled at Dorothy's convenience. Dorothy said Thursday at 4:30 would be fine. She hung up. She sat. She looked at the wall of her office. She did not call Jax. She called her home phone and talked Owen through an after-school checklist she'd left on the refrigerator. She called Beth and confirmed the school pickup for Thursday. She went through the rest of her morning with her head down and her hands doing the work they were supposed to do, and at 3:25, she drove home and made dinner and helped Owen with his homework and read Grace her book and put them to bed, and then sat at the kitchen table alone in the quiet for a long time. The complaint was Linda Foss. Dorothy knew it the same way she knew most things she couldn't prove through the particular configuration of who had reason to, who had access to, and who had the disposition for. Linda had seen the motorcycles. The whole block had seen the motorcycles. 34 Harleys parked on a residential street were not a subtle occurrence. But Linda had also been the one to cut Dorothy's hours without explanation and to schedule two younger employees who were not, as far as Dorothy could tell, more qualified. Linda had looked at her in the parking lot on Dorothy's last day with the expression of a woman who had expected something more satisfying to happen and was surprised that it hadn't. Now she had found the more satisfying thing. Thursday's home visit went better than Dorothy had feared and not as well as she had hoped. Ms. Pruitt was thorough and professional and clearly uncomfortable in the way of people who go into social work because they want to help and find themselves occasionally deployed in the service of someone's grievance instead. The house was warm, the refrigerator was full, the children were healthy and articulate, and Grace showed Ms. Pruitt the strawberries she was growing in a cup on the windowsill, a project she and Dax had started apparently involving the seeds from the November strawberries, and Owen showed her his homework from the week, which was complete and correct because Owen was a methodical child who finished what he started. Ms. Pruitt wrote things down. She asked Dorothy about the motorcycle club. Dorothy explained. Ms. Pruitt wrote things down with a neutral expression that revealed nothing about what she was writing. Before she left, Ms. Pruitt said that the case would remain open for 60 days per standard procedure. Dorothy said she understood. Ms. Pruitt said she was sorry for the inconvenience. Dorothy said she understood that too. After Ms. Pruitt left, Dorothy stood in her kitchen and thought about Linda Foss, and what a person who had spent 22 years managing a law office understood about complaints filed through official channels, and what they cost, and what they were sometimes designed to cost, and whether 60 days of a case being open could cause damage that the eventual closure of the case didn't fully repair. She thought about all of that, and then she made a cup of tea, and she decided she was not going to involve Jax Monroe in something she could handle herself. Craig Holden arrived on a Saturday in February. She didn't recognize him at first. He'd always been the kind of man who was easy to overlook, medium height, medium build, the kind of ordinary that people mistake for harmless. He had been Melissa's boyfriend before he was Melissa's husband, and Dorothy had met him twice at family dinners where Danny had made an effort to be welcoming, and Craig had made an effort to seem worthy of welcoming, and neither of them had quite succeeded. And the subject of Craig had been allowed to quietly retire when Melissa and Danny married 2 years later. Now Craig was standing on her porch on a Saturday morning with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes doing the particular calculation of someone who has decided to do something and has talked himself out of feeling bad about it. Dorothy, he said, he smiled. The smile was of the kind that had been rehearsed. I heard about Danny. I'm so sorry. I should have come sooner. Dorothy looked at him through the screen door. Craig, she said, it's been almost a year. I know, he said. I know. Things have been complicated for me too. I wanted to reach out sooner, I really did. But I've been dealing with my own situation and the time just... He stopped. He started again. Look, I wanted to talk to you about Owen and Grace. I've been thinking a lot about them. They're my kids. I mean, they're Melissa's kids, and Melissa and I. Owen and Grace are Danny's children, Dorothy said. Of course, Craig said quickly. Of course they are. I just meant being Melissa's ex-husband. I have a kind of connection to them. And I've been thinking with you doing this alone, with your health and your age, it might make more sense for someone who could offer them more stability to. Goodbye, Craig, Dorothy said. She closed the door. She stood in her hallway for a moment. Through the door, she could hear Craig starting up again. Something about rights, something about the children's best interests, and she stood very still until his voice faded and she heard his car door close and his engine start and the sound of him pulling away. Then she went to the kitchen and poured out the rest of her coffee because it had gone cold while she was at the door, and she made a fresh cup and sat down. Craig Holden had not come to her door out of concern for Owen and Grace. She had known that before he finished his first sentence. Men who come back out of concern for children they have had no contact with for a year do not show up on Saturdays with rehearsed smiles and calculations behind their eyes. Men who come back for those reasons show up awkward and unsure, and they say the wrong thing and they mean the right thing. And what Craig had said was the right thing, and he had meant the wrong thing, and Dorothy had been reading people for 67 years, and she knew the difference. She called a lawyer on Monday. She could not afford a good one. She found a decent one, a woman named Patricia Sawyer with a small practice downtown who did family law, and who on hearing the situation said she would take the case for a flat rate that was exactly the amount of Dorothy's first full paycheck from Monroe's, which left Dorothy back where she had started financially but with representation. Patricia said the case would likely go to a custody hearing within 60 days. She said the key factors would be stability of the home environment, the relationship of the children with Dorothy versus Craig, and the history of Craig's involvement with the children. What's his history? Patricia asked. He left when Melissa left, Dorothy said. He had no involvement before that except at 2 family dinners where he mostly talked about himself. Good, Patricia said. Not good for them, but good for us. Dorothy paid the retainer. She drove home. She did not tell Owen and Grace. She did not tell Jax Monroe. She dealt with the hearing preparations the way she dealt with everything, by working through it item by item, without complaint, because complaint was a luxury that didn't have space in a schedule that included 2 children, a job she was trying to hold together, and a house that still had an oil burner that made a sound on cold mornings she wasn't sure about. She lost 2 pounds in 3 weeks. She was not sleeping the way she had been sleeping. She woke at 4 in the morning sometimes with the weight of it on her chest, the case file. The caseworker, the 60 days Craig's scheduled smile, the cost of the lawyer, the fear that the things she had built for Owen and Grace over the past 4 months could be taken by a man who had put in none of the hours and wanted the money. And she lay in the dark and breathed. And sometimes that was enough, and sometimes it wasn't. She did not call Jax. She thought about it. She thought about the card in her cardigan pocket and what the number on it meant and what Jax had said when he left her house that November evening. She thought about all of it, and she put the phone down, and she went to work at 7:50, and she came home at 3:25, and she made dinner, and she read to Grace, and she helped Owen with his multiplication tables, and she put them to bed, and she sat alone at her kitchen table in the quiet. She wasn't going to be a burden. She was not going to take more than she had already taken. She had been given something extraordinary in November, and she had accepted it, and she was grateful for it, and she was not going to stand at the door of that generosity again and hold out her hand. This was the logic she used sitting at the kitchen table in February, and it was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either. Bull Carver found her. It was a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February. Dorothy was in the hallway of the Montgomery County Courthouse, sitting on a wooden bench outside the door of a family court hearing room, holding a manila folder of documents on her lap, and waiting for Patricia Sawyer, who was inside with Craig's lawyer discussing procedural matters. Dorothy was wearing her navy blouse again, and her good slacks and her pearl earrings, and she was sitting with her spine straight and her hands flat on the folder, and she was not going to look like what she was, which was a 67-year-old woman who was very frightened. She heard the elevator open. She looked up. Bull Carver came around the corner in a leather jacket, in work pants, carrying what appeared to be a permit application form, which was presumably why he was at the courthouse. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her sitting on that bench outside that particular door. His face did not show what he was thinking. He looked at the folder on her lap. He looked at the nameplate beside the hearing room door. He stood very still for a moment, the way a man stands when he is putting things together quickly and carefully. Then he sat down next to her. "Mrs. Holden," he said. "Bull," she said. He looked at the door. "Family courted," he said. "Yes," she said. "You all right?" "Not especially," she said. He nodded. He sat with her for a moment. His permit application form was folded in his hands and he wasn't doing anything with it. "Anything you want to tell me about," he said. She considered this. She thought about saying no. She thought about the logic of the kitchen table and the card in her pocket and the weight of taking more than you've already taken. She looked at Bull Carver, who had come to her house in November and fixed the porch light and the electrical panel without being asked who had let Owen watch him work, because he'd seen them all watching, who had sat at her table and eaten her food and nodded at her like a person who had a right to be called an equal. She looked at him. "My son's children," she said. "Their mother left and her ex-husband has appeared and filed for custody. He has no relationship with them, and I believe he's doing it for the foster care stipend. My lawyer says the case is survivable, but the odds aren't certain." She paused. "I didn't want to bother anyone with it." Bull was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Holden," he said. "Dorothy. Dorothy." He looked at the permit form in his hands. He turned it over once. "You're going to have to tell me why you would think this wasn't worth calling us about." She started to answer. "No," he said gently. "I'm asking. I want to understand the reasoning." She thought about it honestly. "Because you've already done a great deal," she said. "And I don't know how to keep accepting things. I don't know where the line is. I don't know when it becomes something different than what Jack said it was." "What did Jack say it was?" "That he wanted to make tonight easier and maybe tomorrow," Dorothy said. "That was what he said in November. Tonight and tomorrow." Bull looked at her. His expression was not quite amusement and not quite exasperation. It was the expression of a man who had known Jax Monroe for 30 years and understood that Jax sometimes said short things that meant long things. "Dorothy," he said, "tonight and tomorrow is what you say when you don't want to scare someone off. It doesn't have an expiration date." He put his permit application in his jacket pocket. "I'm calling him." "You don't have to." "I'm calling him," Bull said. He called Jax. He spoke for 45 seconds. He said courthouse, family, court custody of the grandkids. Some man trying to take them. Dorothy wouldn't call. He hung up. Dorothy sat beside him and said nothing. Patricia Sawyer came out of the hearing room and stopped when she saw Bull. She looked at Dorothy. Dorothy introduced them. Patricia shook Bull's hand with the professional composure of a lawyer who had seen stranger things than a large man in a leather jacket at the courthouse on behalf of her client. Patricia said the procedural hearing had gone adequately. The judge had set a formal date for 4 weeks out, and Dorothy should expect Craig's lawyer to submit a character assessment request, which was standard but could be uncomfortable. Bull nodded. He said thank you to Patricia with the same simplicity that he applied to most things. He walked Dorothy to her car. He stood on the sidewalk until she drove out of the parking structure. That night, Jax knocked on her door. Not 34 men this time, just him. One car. He came inside and took off his jacket and sat down at her kitchen table, and Dorothy made coffee and they sat across from each other in the quiet kitchen, and she told him every month, all of it. The DCS complaint and Miss Pruitt and 60 days open and Craig at the door and the retainer to Patricia Sawyer and the hearing date 4 weeks out. Jax listened without interrupting. He did not move while she talked. He had the particular quality in these moments of a man whose stillness was not passivity, but choice, a man who had learned that listening was more useful than responding and who exercised that lesson. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet. "Why didn't you call?" he said. "I didn't want to owe more than I already do," Dorothy said. Something shifted in his face. Not impatience, not frustration. Something more considered. "Dorothy," he said. He waited until she looked at him. "You don't owe me anything. You have never owed me anything. There is no account. There is no ledger. There is nothing that is going to come due." He looked at his coffee cup and then back at her. "But your grandchildren need you to let people help. Not for you, for them. When you decide you've taken enough and you close the door, you're not protecting yourself. You're protecting a feeling at the cost of a fact. And the fact is that those kids need someone in their corner." Dorothy looked at her own coffee cup. "I'm not good at it, she said finally. "Accepting help. Roy used to say I received compliments like I was expecting to be handed a bill." Jax almost smiled. Were you? Usually, Dorothy said. There's no bill, he said. There never was. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Your hearing is 4 weeks from Thursday. Tell me what your lawyer needs. Dorothy told him Patricia had said character witnesses would be valuable people who could speak to Dorothy's role in the children's lives, the stability of the home environment, the quality of the care. Patricia had said she would try to locate Owen's teacher and possibly his school counselor. She had mentioned that any documentation of the home conditions, photographs, schedules, records of medical appointments kept would be useful. Jax nodded as she spoke. He nodded the way he always listened fully, without performing attention, but without withholding it. Ray, he said, he'll speak to the employment. Pop's wife, Norma, will speak to the home visits. I can get you character statements from half a dozen people who have been to that house and seen what it looks like inside. He paused. And I'll be there. If the judge has questions about what the club is and what it isn't, I'm the one to answer them. Jax, you don't have to. I know, he said. I don't do things because I have to. He looked at her steadily. I do things because they're right. This is right. Dorothy looked at him across her kitchen table. Outside the window, the February dark was full and cold, and her street was quiet and the house was warm. She thought about the November evening, and the fire in the fireplace, and the 34 men on the sidewalk, and what she had felt standing in her hallway after they drove away. She thought about how long she had been trying to do this alone, as if doing it alone were a virtue, as if it made the thing more hers, somehow, when what it actually did was make it harder and heavier and more likely to break. She thought about Roy telling her, Dorothy, you are the most competent person I have ever known, and you use your competence to refuse help, and I cannot decide if that's admirable or foolish, and I have known you for 30 years, and I still cannot decide. She thought about Owen asleep in the next room, and Grace in the dresser with the paper-lined drawers and the strawberry seeds growing in a cup on the windowsill. All right, she said. Jax nodded once. He picked up his coffee cup and finished it. He stood. He put on his jacket. He walked to the door. Jax, she said. He turned. Carol would have liked you, Dorothy said. The way you turned out, she would have liked you. Something moved across his face that was private and that she did not try to look at directly. He stood in the doorway for a moment. I like to think so, he said. He pulled the door closed. Dorothy locked it. She stood in her hallway and listened to his car start and pull away, and then she went and checked on the children, and they were both sleeping, and she stood in the doorway of their room for a while with the hall light making a long rectangle on the floor between their beds. 4 weeks, she thought. She could do 4 weeks. The 4 weeks were not easy weeks. Dorothy had been through hard things before. She had buried a husband and then a son inside of 4 years, and she had learned something about the texture of hard things, that they did not feel uniformly heavy, that there were days inside them that were almost normal and days that were not, and the almost normal days were their own particular kind of difficult, because you let your guard down during them, and then the not normal days hit you in a place you'd left unprotected. The custody hearing preparation was not the worst thing she had done, but it occupied a part of her mind that she could not stop occupying it, and the part it occupied was the part that usually kept the rest of her organized. The result was that she made small errors at work, transposed a figure in the receivables, forgot to order the insurance forms she'd been planning to request for 3 weeks, left her coffee sitting on the filing cabinet long enough to go completely cold on 3 separate mornings. Ray said nothing about any of it. She said nothing about any of it. They maintained a professional understanding of each other that included the understanding that people sometimes had things going on outside of work that affected their work, and that the appropriate response was to keep showing up and not require explanation. She appreciated him for that. She told him so once on a Thursday afternoon when she was putting on her coat to leave, and she turned around and he was standing in the doorway of the office with 2 cups of coffee, one for each of them, even though it was 3:20 and she was leaving in 5 minutes. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know, he said. He handed her the cup. Jax told me about the hearing. She took the cup. He shouldn't have. He tells me things I need to know, Ray said. He figured I needed to know this one so I could figure out what to do about it. He leaned against the doorframe. I'm going to submit a written statement to your lawyer this week. 5 months, perfect record, 2 raises, no problems. I'm also going to call the judge's clerk on Monday and make clear that I'm available to appear in person if the written statement isn't sufficient. Dorothy looked at the coffee in her hand. Ray, she said. Dorothy, he said. I don't know how to. You don't have to know how to, he said. He had the same quality his brother had in certain moments of saying the thing plainly and leaving no room for unnecessary elaboration. Drink your coffee and go home to your grandkids. Come back Monday. That's all. She drank her coffee. She went home. On the Saturday before the hearing, Norma Decker appeared at Dorothy's door at 10 in the morning with a Dutch oven full of something that smelled like beef stew, a bag of things for the children that included a coloring book for Grace and a model airplane kit for Owen that was based on the picture on the box going to occupy the next 4 weekends of Owen's life, and a look on her face that said she had not come only to bring food. She came in and put the Dutch oven on the stove and sat down at the kitchen table with Dorothy while Grace colored and Owen read the model airplane instructions with an intensity usually reserved for people trying to defuse something, and Norma said without preamble, "Pop is submitting a statement. So am I. Between the two of us, we've been in your house 7 times. We know what it looks like. I'm going to tell that court exactly what I saw every time I came through that door." Dorothy said, "Norma, you really don't have to." Norma looked at her the way a woman of 65 looks at someone who has just said something she has already decided is incorrect. "I raised 4 children," Norma said. "I know what a good home looks like. I know what it sounds like and what it smells like, and I know the difference between a house where children are surviving and a house where children are thriving, and yours is the second kind, and I'm going to go to that courthouse, and I'm going to say so in front of whoever needs to hear it." She picked up her coffee cup. "Also, I know a woman who knows Craig Holden's ex-girlfriend from before Melissa, and I have some thoughts about his character that may or may not be useful to your attorney." Dorothy looked at her. "How do you know that?" Dorothy said. "Small towns," Norma said with the serenity of someone who has lived in them long enough to understand that small towns were their own form of intelligence network. "I'll call my friend Sunday evening, and you can pass whatever she says along to your lawyer Monday morning." Dorothy passed it along to Patricia Sawyer Monday morning. Patricia listened carefully and said, "That's useful. That's very useful, actually." She did not elaborate on what she was going to do with it, which Dorothy understood to mean that she was going to do something lawyerly with it that was best not discussed in advance. Wednesday came. She made the children pancakes for breakfast, which she did not usually do on Wednesdays, because she had the ingredients and because she thought it might be the last time she made pancakes in her kitchen for a while without the weight of Thursday being tomorrow. Owen ate 4, Grace ate 2.5, and declared herself a pancake expert, which was a status she applied to herself regarding anything she had recently consumed. Dorothy drove to Monroe's. She worked until noon, which was 4 hours earlier than usual, and Ray did not say anything about it because she had arranged it with him the week before. She drove home. She spent the afternoon with the children, Owen's homework, Grace's coloring, a walk around the block because the temperature had come up to 42 degrees, and 42 degrees in February in Tennessee felt like a reprieve. They went around the block twice, Grace between Dorothy and Owen, holding both of their hands, narrating everything she saw with the comprehensive attention of someone who believed that no object in the world was beneath comment. Dorothy watched her walking and narrating and pointing at a dog behind a fence and leaning against Dorothy's leg as she pointed, using Dorothy as a post, and she thought, not this man's, not his, mine. She drove them home. She made spaghetti for dinner. She gave them baths. She read to Grace a book about a bear and a rabbit who had a disagreement about the weather. She turned off the light. She came back to the kitchen. She sat at the table. She took the card out of her cardigan pocket. She looked at the phone number. She put it back. She said quietly to the empty kitchen, "Roy, I could use a little help tomorrow." The kitchen did not answer. But the furnace was running and the house was warm, and there was food in the refrigerator, and her grandchildren were asleep in the next room. And outside on the quiet street she had noticed this when she came in from the walk, a motorcycle parked 2 houses down that had not been there in the morning. Not 34, just one. Dark blue older, parked, waiting. Dorothy looked at the kitchen window. She could not see the street from where she sat. She knew the bike was there. She thought about what it meant that it was there that Jax Monroe had driven 35 miles to park on her street and sit in the cold on a Wednesday night so that she would know if she looked that someone was there. She did not call him. She didn't need to call him. She just needed to know, and she knew. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed. In the morning, the bike was gone, and she dressed in her navy blouse and her pearl earrings and drove to the courthouse. The Montgomery County Courthouse on a Thursday morning in the middle of February looked like what it was, a building built in 1962 that had been designed to last and had done so, though not gracefully, through a series of renovations that had left it with fluorescent lighting, low ceilings, and the particular smell of public buildings everywhere, floor wax and old paper, and the specific staleness of air that has been breathed by too many anxious people over too many decades. Dorothy arrived at 8:15 with Patricia Sawyer, who was wearing her navy suit and carrying a leather briefcase that had a small scrape on the left corner and looked for that reason like a briefcase that had actually been places and done things. Patricia had reviewed everything they were bringing, 6 character statements, including one from Ray Monroe that was 2.5 pages of precise, specific documentation about Dorothy's employment record, and one from Norma Decker that was 3 pages and included Patricia said a passage about the state of Dorothy's refrigerator in November that had actually made Patricia emotional when she'd read it, which she mentioned with some professional embarrassment. Owen's teacher had submitted a written statement. His school counselor had added a note. The photographs Patricia had asked Dorothy to compile, 37 of them, taken on her phone over 5 months of the children in the house. At the table doing homework at the birthday party on Halloween, Owen with the carburetor in the driveway, Grace with her strawberry cup on the windowsill, had been organized into a packet that Patricia called the strongest exhibit she'd prepared in an uncontested residential setting in 12 years. Dorothy sat in the hallway outside the hearing room while Patricia went in for the preliminary conference. She sat with her back straight and her hands flat on her knees and her pearl earrings in her ears, and she looked at the opposite wall, which was a beige institutional wall that offered nothing to look at, and she breathed. At 8:40, Craig's lawyer came down the hallway from the elevator. Craig came behind him. Craig was wearing a blazer and pressed trousers and a tie that looked like it might have been purchased specifically for today, and he was carrying flowers, a small bouquet of something yellow, the kind you find at a grocery store near the exit wrapped in cellophane. Dorothy looked at the flowers and understood immediately what they were for, and the understanding made her jaw tighten. Craig saw her. He arranged his face into an expression of warm concern. "Dorothy," he said, "I hope we can get through this in a way that's good for everyone." Dorothy looked at him. She did not say anything. Craig's lawyer touched his arm and they went through the hearing room door. Patricia came out 60 seconds later. She looked at Dorothy and said, "The judge is ready. We go in." They went in. The hearing room was small. 6 rows of wooden benches on each side of a central aisle, a raised bench at the front, 2 tables facing the bench. Craig and his lawyer sat at the right table. Dorothy and Patricia sat at the left. In the rows behind Dorothy, there were 3 people. Norma Decker in a cream-colored blouse and reading glasses pushed up on her head, holding a small purse on her lap, Ray Monroe. In a button-down shirt and dark pants that suggested he had asked someone for help choosing them because they were not the clothes of a man who usually chose carefully. And Patricia's paralegal, a young woman named Claire, who had spent the previous week organizing the exhibit packet and who sat with it on her lap now with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what was in it. The judge came in at 9 o'clock. Her name was the Honorable Patricia Gaines, and she was somewhere in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the manner of a woman who had heard a great many things in this room and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them and was interested primarily in getting to the truth efficiently and deciding what was fair. Craig's lawyer went first. He was competent and smooth in the way of lawyers who have built a practice on paperwork rather than courtroom work, and what he presented was a careful arrangement of concerns. Dorothy's age, her financial instability at the time of the original placement, the alleged involvement of a motorcycle organization in the household, the question of whether a 67-year-old woman with a recent job change was adequately positioned to provide long-term stability to 2 young children. He did not speak about Craig's relationship with the children. He spoke entirely about Dorothy's limitations. Dorothy noted this. Patricia's cross-examination of Craig was short and precisely targeted. She asked him in sequence when he had last seen Owen, when he had last seen Grace, whether he had attended any school events for either child, whether he had spoken to Owen or Grace by phone in the previous 12 months, whether he had sent birthday cards, Christmas gifts, any form of communication, whether he had contributed financially to the children's care at any point since Melissa had left. Craig's answers to all of these questions were no. Patricia asked him without inflection what his current employment was. He said he was in between positions, but had prospects. She asked whether he owned or rented his current residence. He rented. She asked whether the lease was in his name alone. He said yes. She asked whether his current living situation included another adult. He said yes, his girlfriend. She asked how long they had been together. 8 months. She asked whether his girlfriend had met Owen or Grace. He said there hadn't been an opportunity. Patricia said no further questions. Judge Gaines looked at Craig over her reading glasses for a moment that was long enough to mean something, and then looked down at the documents in front of her. Then Patricia called Ray Monroe. Ray walked to the witness stand with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never been in a courtroom before and was not going to pretend otherwise and was also not going to be intimidated by it. He sat down. He identified himself. Patricia asked him to describe Dorothy Holden's work performance over the 5 months she had been employed at his shop. Ray described it for 15 minutes. He described it in the specific concrete terms of a man who dealt in specifics and concretes the number of unbilled service hours she had recovered in her first month, the error rate in the accounts she had inherited, and the error rate after she restructured them, the vendor credit she had negotiated by reorganizing the payment schedule, the fact that he had given her 2 raises in 5 months and was planning a third, the fact that she arrived every morning but before anyone else and had never missed a day or been late, and had on 2 occasions when something came up outside of office hours responded to his calls within 20 minutes. He said she is the best hire I've made in 12 years of running that shop. He said it without decoration. Craig's lawyer asked Ray on cross, isn't it true that Mrs. Holden is employed by your brother's referral, suggesting a personal rather than professional relationship? Ray said yes. The lawyer asked, and doesn't that suggest the employment might be considered charity rather than genuine merit? Ray looked at the lawyer for a moment. He said, I run a business. I don't keep employees who can't do the job out of charity. My brother has introduced me to maybe 15 people over the years I've known him, and I've hired 2 of them. Dorothy is one. The other one I let go after 6 weeks because he wasn't right for the position. Charity has nothing to do with it. Craig's lawyer said no further questions. Patricia called Norma Decker. Norma walked to the witness stand with the posture of a woman who had been to enough formal occasions in her life to know how to carry herself in them. She sat down. She folded her hands in her lap. She described the state of Dorothy's home in November, the thermostat at 59 degrees, the food situation, the improvised furniture arrangement, and then she described its state every time she'd come after that. She described the warmth. She described the food. She described Owen's project with the carburetor and Grace's strawberry seeds on the windowsill and the homework spread on the kitchen table 3 separate times. She had arrived unannounced and found Dorothy working through it with Owen. She described the way Owen talked to his grandmother and the way Grace leaned against Dorothy's leg when she told stories. She said, I have raised 4 children and I have grandchildren of my own, and I know what a home looks like where children feel safe. That is what I saw every time I went to that house. Craig's lawyer did not cross-examine Norma. Patricia submitted the exhibit packet, the photographs, the teacher's statement, the counselor's note, the employment records, the lease agreement, the bank statements showing the trajectory of Dorothy's financial situation since November, the records of medical appointments kept and immunizations current. Judge Gaines looked at the packet for a long time. She asked Craig's lawyer whether his client had any character witnesses to submit. The lawyer said they had not brought character witnesses today. The judge looked at Craig. She asked him directly, when did you last see Owen and Grace? Craig said it had been some months. The judge asked how many months. Craig said he wasn't sure exactly. The judge said, to your knowledge, are both children currently enrolled in school? Craig said he believed so. The judge said, what? School? Craig looked at his lawyer. The lawyer looked at the table. The judge returned her attention to the documents in front of her. She read for approximately 3 minutes. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them has been told to wait and is waiting. Then the door at the back of the hearing room opened. Dorothy heard it. She turned not fully, just enough to see it with her peripheral vision. They came in without sound. 27 men in neat rows filling the benches. They were not wearing vests. They were in collared shirts, in dark pants, and in one case, Pop Decker, the full-dress uniform of a decorated veteran, complete with the ribbons in the posture that went with what. Bull was there in the suit he had worn to his daughter's wedding 3 years ago. Sparks was in his electrician's uniform, the one with his name on the chest and the union logo on the shoulder. Dax was there. And the man with the healed cast and the older white-haired man, Dorothy recognized from the sidewalk in November, and others she knew from the club's Sundays, and others she didn't. They sat, every one of them. They filled 2 rows behind the 3 people who had already been there. They sat with their backs straight and their hands on their knees, and they looked at the judge's bench with the attentiveness of people who were present for a reason and understood what the reason was. Judge Gaines looked up from her documents. She looked at the rows of men behind Dorothy. She looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Craig. Craig was looking at the rows of men with an expression that had gone from the curated, warm concern of earlier in the morning to something without any curation at all. It was the expression of a man who had done an arithmetic calculation that had not come out in his favor. Jax was at the end of the second row. He was sitting very still, the way he sat still at Dorothy's kitchen table, the way he did everything with complete presence and without performance. He met Dorothy's eyes briefly. He nodded once, very small. Not reassurance exactly, more like you're not alone, more like we are here. Dorothy turned back to the front. Her eyes were stinging. She blinked twice and pressed her lips together and breathed. Judge Gaines set down the document she had been reading. She removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench in front of her. She looked at the room. She said, "I have reviewed all submitted materials in this matter." She said, "I have heard testimony from 2 witnesses for the petitioner, and I have noted the complete absence of witnesses for the respondent." She said, "I have examined the financial records, the employment records, the documentation of home conditions, and the statements from the children's school and medical providers." She paused. She said the children, Owen age 8 and Grace age 5, have been in Dorothy Holden's care for 8 months following the death of their father. In that time, by all accounts available to this court, they are thriving. They are enrolled in school. They are healthy. They are demonstrably loved and consistently present in the life of someone who shows up for them every single day. She looked at Craig. She said, "This court finds no evidence of any sustained parental involvement on your part with either child. This court finds that your petition has been filed without the foundation of an established relationship with the children in question, and that the circumstances you have cited as concerns regarding Mrs. Holden's fitness have been addressed and contradicted thoroughly by the record before me." She said, "Custody remains with Dorothy Holden full and uncontested. Mr. Holden, if you wish to establish a relationship with these children in the future, you will need to do so through a supervised visitation arrangement, which this court will consider upon application, provided evidence of stable employment and housing at that time." She looked at Craig's lawyer. She said, "Counsel, your client will also be responsible for Mrs. Holden's legal fees in this matter." She said it the way she said everything plainly without drama, as a fact that had been determined and was now simply a fact. She picked up her gavel. She set it down once. She said, "We're adjourned." Craig stood before the gavel came down. He was already turning toward the aisle before the room began to process what had happened. He did not look at Dorothy. He walked out with his lawyer behind him and the cellophane-wrapped flowers still on the table where he'd set them down at the start of the hearing and apparently forgotten about. Dorothy sat. Patricia put her hand on Dorothy's arm. "Dorothy," she said, "you won." Dorothy nodded. She was looking at the table. "Dorothy," Patricia said. "I know," Dorothy said. "I know. I just need a moment." She sat at the table while the room behind her became a different kind of room. Quieter, less held-breath people beginning to move and speak in low voices. She could hear, without turning, the particular sound of 27 men getting up from wooden benches, the scrape of coats, the murmur of voices. She could hear Pop Decker's deliberate tread on the floor. She could hear Norma saying something to Ray in the low, sensible register she used for everything. And then she heard close behind her the chair pushed back carefully and the weight of a large man standing. She turned around. Jax was standing at the end of the bench 3 feet away. He looked at her with the same steady eyes as November. The same quality of a man who was not going to perform this moment, but was simply in it. Dorothy stood up. She walked the 3 feet between them, and she held out her hand. He took it. His grip was the same as November firm brief meant. She held it a second longer than a handshake was supposed to last, and he let her. "Thank you," she said. "All of you. Thank you." Jax looked at her. "It's a good outcome," he said. "How are you?" "I'm going to go home and make pancakes," she said. He almost smiled. "Good," he said. "Pancakes are correct." Behind him, the men were filling out of the room. Some of them nodded at Dorothy as they went. Pop Decker stopped and put his hand on her shoulder very briefly, the way veterans touch people they want to say something to without finding the words. Bull gave her a nod that covered everything that would take an hour to say out loud. Dax looked like he wanted to ask whether she was all right and thought better of it. Patricia drove her home. Dorothy sat in the passenger seat and watched Clarksville go by the streets she'd been driving for 8 months, and everything looked the same as it had looked this morning, and it was all completely different. She thought about Owen at school right now in his too big sweatshirt working a math problem. She thought about Grace in her kindergarten classroom, probably talking to someone, probably explaining something with great authority. She thought about them coming off the school bus at 3:30 running up the walk and what she was going to say when she opened the door. Patricia pulled up in front of Dorothy's house. "Get some rest," she said. Dorothy thanked her. She got out of the car. She stood in front of her house, the porch with its working light, the living room window with Grace's strawberry cup visible on the sill, the front walk that someone had salted last week when it iced over, and she breathed. The months after the hearing moved differently than the months before. There was, as there always is after a long fight, a kind of exhaustion that comes out on the other side of it. Not the desperate exhaustion of the fighting itself, but a quieter kind, the exhaustion of having been tense for a long time and finally being allowed to put that tension down. Dorothy felt it on the weekends mostly. She felt it in the mornings before she was fully awake, in the place between sleep and consciousness, where the mind goes before it has remembered its instructions. Then she would remember Thursday happened. Thursday was over. She had won. She let herself feel that for a few days. She let herself be tired in the specific way of someone who has been fighting for a long time and can finally stop fighting. She took the children to the park on a Saturday afternoon in late February and sat on a bench in the cold and watched Owen run and Grace attempt to fly a kite that Dax had left at the house the previous weekend. And she did not think about Craig or the DCS case or the legal fees or the property tax still sitting in the lawyer's office in Ashland City. She sat on the bench and watched her grandchildren, and she let the fight be over. It took 2 weeks before she felt fully like herself again. 2 weeks in which she slept through the night every night and ate full meals and returned calls she had been putting off, including a call to her sister Barbara in Cincinnati, who had been leaving messages since December and who needed more than anything else to hear Dorothy's voice and know that she was holding up. Dorothy called her on a Sunday evening after the children were in bed, and they talked for an hour and a half, which was longer than they had talked in years, and Barbara cried twice, and Dorothy held herself together and told her sister, "I'm all right, I mean it. I am genuinely all right." And she meant it, which was the new thing, the thing that had not been true in March or April or May or through the summer or into the fall, but was true now. She was genuinely structurally all right. And it had been built piece by a series of people who showed up on a cold November evening and put their hands to it. She had thanked Jax again a week after the hearing at one of the Sunday cookouts that had started appearing in her backyard with the regularity of weather. She had pulled him aside near the garage where he had been talking to Bull about something mechanical, and she had said simply, "I want you to know that what you did in that courtroom is something I will not forget for the rest of my life." He had looked at her with the steadiness she had learned to expect from him and said, "You did that. We just showed up." There's a difference. She had started to argue, and he had raised one hand, not sharply, just clearly, in the way that meant the conversation was complete. And she had let it be complete because some things didn't need to be argued. They only needed to be felt, and she felt it. She worked. She kept her mornings at Monroe's and her afternoons with Owen and Grace and her evenings in the kitchen, which had become the center of things in the way that kitchens become centers of things when someone is actually cooking in them. She had learned over the fall and winter to cook better than she had cooked before, not from classes or books, but from Norma, who came by on Sunday afternoons and sat at the table and talked Dorothy through things with the patient precision of someone who had been feeding people for 40 years and had opinions about all of it. Norma taught her a peach cobbler that the first time Dorothy made it on her own, Grace pronounced the best thing she had ever eaten in her life, a statement Grace made frequently, and that Dorothy chose to believe was specifically true in this instance. Ray gave her the third raise in April, office manager as promised. It came with a bump in pay and a key to the front office and an arrangement where on the 2 days a week Ray needed coverage past 3:30, Dorothy could bring the children into the waiting room and they could do homework at the table by the coffee maker while she finished. Owen became a regular presence in the waiting room on those afternoons. He talked to the mechanics. One of them, A young man named Griffin, who had been working in the shop since he was 16 and was now 22, and building a reputation as someone who could diagnose an engine problem by sound, alone took an interest in Owen and began without ceremony teaching him things. Owen started coming home on those afternoons with grease on his hands and a particular look of someone who has been given access to a world that had previously been unavailable. Ray said nothing about Owen being there. He did say once watching Owen and Griffin in the bay from the doorway of the office, "That kid listens. Some kids listen, and some kids just wait for their turn to talk. He listens." "He always has," Dorothy said. "He gets it from his father." Ray nodded. He went back to his bay. Spring came. The strawberry plants that Grace had grown from seeds in a cup on the windowsill were moved to a planter on the porch in April. By May, they had produced 3 actual strawberries, small and intensely red, which Grace ate one by one on a Sunday morning with great ceremony, describing the flavor of each one in elaborate and largely invented terms. Dax came by that Sunday for a club cookout that had migrated to Dorothy's backyard. This had become gradually a once-a-month occurrence. The picnic tables appearing, and the coolers and the grill, and enough food for 40 people, and Grace showed him the strawberry plants, and he examined them with the seriousness they deserved. "You grew these," he said. "From seeds," Grace confirmed. "In my window." "In January." "In winter," Grace said in the tone of someone who wanted credit for the full difficulty of the achievement. "That's impressive," Dax said. "I know," Grace said. On Grace's birthday in late May, the Iron Cross MC arrived in the backyard in a configuration that Grace took full credit for, though she had not actually asked them to come. She had mentioned it to Dax 3 weeks before, "I'm going to have a birthday," and left the rest to him, which turned out to be a reasonable strategy. There was a cake. There were 22 people in the backyard. Pop's cornbread was there. Norma's cobbler was there. Someone had brought a ribbon-wrapped box containing an art kit of a scope that suggested they had asked someone who knew Grace. Grace blew out the candles in one breath and did not make a wish out loud because she informed the gathered company wishes were private. There was no argument from the company. Jack sat at the end of the table and watched all of it with the expression he always wore at these gatherings, present, attentive, not requiring anything of the moment. Dorothy watched him watching and thought not for the first time this is what he made. Not just for her and Owen and Grace, but for all of them. The table that kept getting longer. After the party, after the children were in bed and the backyard was clean, and the last of the men had said their goodbyes, Dorothy and Jack sat on the back porch in 2 chairs someone had brought and apparently decided to leave. The evening was warm enough to sit outside. The yard was quiet. 6, Jack said. "She'll be 7 before I know what happened," Dorothy said. "That's how it goes," he said. They sat for a while in the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had been through something together and didn't need to talk about it every time they were in the same room. "I'm going to apply for formal guardianship," Dorothy said. "Legal permanent. Patricia says the grounds are solid." "They are," Jack said. "I want it done before they're much older. I want them to know it's settled." "Good thinking. Will you?" She stopped. She started again. "Would you be willing to be listed as an emergency contact, not legal? Just if something happened to me, someone who would come." He looked at her. "I'm already the person who would come," he said. "I know," Dorothy said, "but I'd like it in writing." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Yes, thank you," she said. They sat in the warm evening, and somewhere down the street, someone's sprinkler came on the regular mechanical sound of summer evenings, and a dog barked twice and stopped. Dorothy thought about nothing specific and everything at once, which was what summer evenings on a porch were for. "Jax," she said. What was Carol's favorite season?" He was quiet long enough that she thought perhaps she had said the wrong thing or asked too much. "Summer," he said finally. She said winter was beautiful, but summer was alive. She liked alive. "She sounds right," Dorothy said. "She usually was," he said. The sprinkler turned off. The evening settled. Across the yard in the window of the children's room, the nightlight was on the small, warm circle of it, visible through the glass. Dorothy looked at it. She thought about Carol, about Roy, about Danny, the people who couldn't be here, whose absence was the shape that everything else had to grow around. She thought about how grief didn't go away but changed form, how it started as a wall. And over time, if you were doing it right, if you let people in and let things happen and kept your hands open, it became something you could live inside of rather than something that was living inside of you. She thought about Jax's promise at Carol's grave and what it meant to be the person that promise had extended itself to. She thought about the enormous improbability of it, a man running out of coffee on a Tuesday afternoon, a store on a route he'd taken 100 times before, a woman with $5.83 who had not been going to ask the question she asked and asked it anyway. She thought about the distance between that parking lot and this porch, what that distance had contained and what it had cost and what it had given back. She thought maybe Roy is doing something like that too. Maybe Danny is. Maybe every good thing any of them did is still out there somewhere moving. 14 months after the November evening at Family Foods, a Thursday in January just past noon, Dorothy was at the grocery store. Not Family Foods. She'd found a store on the other side of town with better produce and lower prices, a medium-sized store with wide aisles and a good discount rack. She had a full cart. She had a list, and she was most of the way through it with Owen's cereal and Grace's yogurt and the ingredients for the roast chicken she'd been planning for Sunday. She turned into the bread aisle. At the far end of the aisle, a woman was standing in front of the discount rack. She was maybe 40, maybe a little less, wearing a thin jacket over a sweatshirt that wasn't quite enough for January. Her hair was back in the quick, unreflective way of someone who had put it up and stopped thinking about it and was now in public realizing too late that this was how she was going to look. She was holding a loaf of white bread, the kind marked down because it was 2 days from expiration, and she was looking at it the way a person looks at something they are not sure they can justify. Dorothy stopped her cart. She looked at the woman, at the jacket, at the hands on the bread, at the particular angle of the shoulders drawn in protective, the angle of someone who was trying to take up less space than she actually occupied. Dorothy had seen that angle before. She had been that angle. The woman turned slightly. She looked at the bread. She put it back. She picked it up again. Dorothy moved before she thought about moving. She pushed her cart to the end of the aisle and she said quietly, "Hey." The woman looked up. Her eyes went immediately to the middle distance, the instinct of someone who had learned not to make eye contact when they were embarrassed, and then came back to Dorothy. "Hey," Dorothy said again softer. "Come with me a second." The woman's eyes went uncertain. "I'm sorry." "It's okay," Dorothy said. "I promise it's okay. Just come walk with me for a minute. Can you do that?" The woman looked at the bread in her hands. She looked at Dorothy. She was assessing the way women in difficult situations learn to assess quickly and thoroughly whether something is safe or not. Dorothy understood this. She stood still and she let herself be assessed, and she kept her face what it was, no performance, no pity, just the look of a woman who had been in the place. This other woman was standing and wanted to say so. Something in the woman's face shifted. She put the bread back. "Okay," she said. Dorothy turned her cart around. She began walking back up the aisle toward the main section of the store, and the woman fell in beside her. Not close a natural distance, the distance of two people who are doing something together that one of them doesn't fully understand yet. "What are your kids like?" Dorothy said. The woman blinked. "I only have one, a girl. She's 6. "What is she like?" She likes pasta and fruit. She goes through a lot of fruit." "Good," Dorothy said. "Easy. Let's start with pasta." They went to the pasta aisle. Dorothy let the woman pick. She picked store brand. Dorothy picked up the next size up and put it in her cart and said, "This one lasts longer." The woman started to say something. Dorothy said with a particular calm of someone who had been on the receiving end of us and knew exactly how the next 30 seconds needed to go. "I know what you're thinking. Don't. It's groceries. That's all this is." The woman's face did something complicated. They went through the store together. Dorothy moved them through it with the confidence of someone who knew where everything was and had a plan. Pasta sauce, bread, 2 loaves, dairy produce, meat. At the fruit section, the woman picked up a small container of blueberries and looked at the price and put it back, and Dorothy picked it up and put it in the cart, and when the woman opened her mouth, Dorothy said, "For Saturdays. Saturdays should have a treat." The woman closed her mouth. Her eyes went wet. She blinked hard. She was fighting it the way women fight it in grocery stores, the way Dorothy had fought it 14 months ago at a counter with a man behind her who didn't tell her to stop. Dorothy did not tell her to stop. She kept moving. At the register, the total came to $174. Dorothy paid with her card the way a person pays for groceries without ceremony. She walked the woman out to the parking lot and helped her with the bags because the woman hadn't brought a cart and was trying to carry everything at once. At the woman's car, a sedan with a bumper sticker from a school 2 towns over, and a crack in the rear window that had been there long enough to have tape over the edges, Dorothy loaded the bags into the trunk. She closed it. She stood beside it. The woman was looking at her with an expression Dorothy remembered. Not quite gratitude, not quite disbelief. The expression of someone who has been treated with grace by a stranger and doesn't have a word for how that feels yet. Dorothy reached into her coat pocket. She took out a folded piece of paper. She had written the number the night before after she'd gone to bed and not slept and gotten up and found a pen and a piece of paper and written it in the quiet kitchen while the house slept around her because she had known it was coming. She had been waiting for the day when she was in the right place at the right time, and she had wanted to be ready. She handed the paper to the woman. "That's a phone number," Dorothy said, "when you need something, not if, when. It could be tonight or it could be 6 months from now. It could be anything. You call that number any hour and say that Dorothy gave you this. They will come. They will not ask for anything in return, ever. Do you understand?" The woman looked at the paper. "Who is it?" she said. "A man named Jax," Dorothy said. "He has people, good people, the best people I know." The woman looked at the number, her hand closed around the paper. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Dorothy looked at her. She thought about the answer, not the short one, not the one about November and the parking lot, and $5.83, but the longer one. The one that started with Carol Monroe, who had reached for help and found no hand. The one that included Roy saying, "Keep your hands open." The one that went through the whole year, the fire in the fireplace, the furnace coming on the pancakes on a Wednesday morning, the judge's gavel, the strawberries on the porch in May. The whole long answer, 14 months of it. She found the short version of the long answer. "Because someone did it for me, she said. "And he did it because someone should have done it for someone he loved and didn't. It goes back. It goes all the way back. But you're part of it now. You're in it." She looked at the woman steadily. "And the only thing that ever gets asked of anybody in this particular thing is that when you're ready, when you're on the other side of whatever you're in right now, you walk up to someone who's where you are today and you do the same thing. That's all. That's the whole deal." The woman held the paper. Her eyes were full. "Drive home safe," Dorothy said. She stepped back from the car. The woman got in. She sat for a moment. Dorothy could see her through the window, hands on the wheel, not moving, just sitting in the particular stillness of a person who has just had something happen to them that is going to take a while to understand. Then she started the engine. She backed out slowly. She drove to the exit of the lot and turned onto the main road and was gone. Dorothy stood at the back of the empty parking space for a long moment. She thought about Jax in the Family Foods parking lot in November, watching her drive away. She thought about what he'd done and then gone home and not been able to meditate and called his brothers and driven across town in the cold. She thought about the bike parked 2 houses down on the Wednesday night before the hearing, dark blue older just there. She thought about the promise made at a graveside 20 years ago for a woman named Carol, and how that promise had moved through time and found her standing in a grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon with $5.83 and 2 grandchildren in the car and a question she almost didn't ask. She took out her phone. She called him. It rang twice. "Dorothy," he said. "Jax," she said. "Someone's going to call you. Her name, I didn't get her name. She has a 6-year-old girl. I gave her your number." A pause. "Where are you?" he said. "Parking lot of Martin's on Willow, but I'm leaving." "How was she?" Dorothy thought about the jacket, the shoulders, the hand closing around a piece of paper. "She'll be okay," Dorothy said. "She's going to be okay." "All right," Jax said. "Jax," Dorothy said. "Yeah." She stood in the parking lot in January with the cold moving through her coat and her own grocery bag still waiting in her cart and the distant sound of Route 41 going by somewhere behind the tree line. "Does it stop?" she said. "The weight of it, the carrying it, does it ever stop being heavy?" A long pause, the sound of wind somewhere on his end or traffic. "No," he said, "but you get stronger and you're not carrying it alone." Another pause, quieter. "You're going to be all right, Dorothy." "I know," she said. "I know you know," he said. "I just like saying it." She laughed. It came out genuine and unplanned, the kind of laugh that arrives before you decide to let it. "Go home," she said. "You're going to get a call." "I'm ready," he said. "I'm always ready." A pause. "Drive safe." "Drive safe," she said. She hung up. She loaded her own groceries into her own trunk. She got in her car. She sat for a moment before she started it, not because she needed to gather courage this time, but because she wanted to be here for one more minute in this specific moment before it became memory. She thought about the woman driving home right now with a trunk full of food and a piece of paper with a phone number on it. She thought about what she was going to find when she got there, what it was going to feel like to put the groceries away in a way that meant something. She thought about the phone call that was coming maybe tonight, maybe in a week, and Jack's picking up and what would happen after that. The brothers called, the engines started. The engines that had started for her on a November evening on Sycamore Lane, 34 of them, one by one, until the sound gathered and became something larger than itself and then moved into the night. She started the car. She drove home through January streets to a warm house where the furnace was running and two children would be home at 3:30 and dinner needed to be started and there was a peach cobbler to think about for Sunday because Sunday was a good day for cobbler and Grace would be extremely pleased about it. And that was one of the reliable good things in the world, one of the things you could count on when other things shifted around you. She drove past the elementary school. She drove past the Methodist church. She drove down Sycamore Lane and pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment with the engine running the way she had sat in the Family Foods parking lot 14 months ago. But the stillness was different now. Then she had been gathering herself for something she was not sure she could do. Now she was simply here in her own driveway in front of her own house, with its porch light on in the January gray and its warm rooms waiting, and she was thinking about what the year had been and what it had cost and what it had given back. In March, she had buried her son and believed in the particular wordless way that grief makes you believe things in the middle of the night, that this was where everything ended. In November, she had stood at a counter in a grocery store and thought, I cannot ask for this. And then she had asked. And from that asking had come all the rest. The fire in the fireplace, the furnace running, the job that gave her back her usefulness, the hearing one, the summer evenings, the strawberries on the porch, Grace pronouncing herself a pancake expert, Owen with grease on his hands and the look of a boy who has been let into somewhere new and knows it. Two beds with frames, a dresser with paper-lined drawers, a kitchen where someone cooked every night, and the smell of it moved through the whole house and reached the children wherever they were and meant you are home and you are fed and the person who loves you is here. A phone number in a cardigan pocket, a promise that had been made at a graveside 20 years ago and had traveled by its own logic across time and circumstance, and a running out of coffee on a Tuesday afternoon to find a woman who needed it standing at a grocery store counter with $5.83 in a question she almost didn't ask. She had needed it. She had let herself need it. Those were two different things, and the second one had taken longer to learn. She turned off the engine. She gathered her grocery bags. She walked up her front steps, and the porch light came on the way it had come on every evening since November, steady and reliable, the way things were when someone had fixed them and intended them to stay fixed. She drove home. She thought about Carol, who had made all of this possible by being someone whose absence had to mean something. She thought about the way a person's life kept moving after them, outward and forward, into the people who carried what they'd left behind. She thought about Roy telling her years ago on their back porch in Ohio, on a summer evening, that felt something like this one, Dorothy, when you plant something good, you don't always get to see what it grows into. That's not a reason not to plant it. She had planted nothing. She had only shown up to a grocery store with $5.83 and asked a question she almost didn't ask. But the thing that had grown from that moment, the warmth in the house, the fire in the fireplace, the job that gave her back her usefulness, the hearing one the children sleeping safely, the porch in summer and the coloring books and the strawberries and the cornbread and Norma's cobbler and Griffin teaching Owen how to listen to an engine, all of that had grown from a promise that someone else planted long before she arrived at the register of Family Foods on a Tuesday in November. She was just the next place it grew. Behind her, somewhere in Tennessee, a phone rang. A man picked it up. He listened. He said, "Yes, ma'am. Tell me where you are." He stood up. He put on his vest. He walked to the door. The promise moved forward, as it always had, into the next person who needed it. The chain held.